True crime is a form of media and entertainment that has been around for centuries. People have been interested in the misdeeds of other people for a very long time. However, modern-day true crime media tends to focus and hone in solely on crimes that shock and disturb us for entertainment purposes. In this video, I want to evaluate as to whether the true crime genre is accurately representing crime as a whole and the influence it has on people's perception of crime, as well as how well true crime considers the impact it has on victims and family members and friends of victims. Let's do a brief little history lesson on true crime itself. One of the first instances of true crime media was actually in late Ming Dynasty China, with Jiang Yingyu's The Book of Swindles, which was published around 1617. It compiled stories of alleged cases of fraud. Not stalking or locking somebody away in a basement for a really long time. Fraud. Not what we think of when we think of true crime today. However, what we consider to be true crime can be found even earlier than this fraud case book. Between the years 1550 to 1700 in Britain, hundreds of pamphlets and street literature about murders and other crimes were published. Was this because between 1550 and 1700 there were mass amounts of homicide cases and they were suddenly reporting on them? No, it's because literacy rates increased in Britain, and easier, cheaper ways of printing out pamphlets became available. And while it was a form of media that people consumed as literacy, it wasn't necessarily purely for entertainment. For some people, it served as a warning system. Mass media didn't exist back then. Phones were first invented in 1876, radios in 1895, and TVs weren't invented until 1927. By the time of the Jack the Ripper case in 1888, phones had only been available for around 12 years, and you'd have to be pretty wealthy to be able to afford one. They were seen as luxury items, the very same way that fridges, when they were first released in America, were luxury items and part of the American dream. There was no other effective way in order to warn other people in your area about crime. Police also weren't trusted at all. The relationship between police and the impoverished has never been particularly good. Considering that most of these crimes occurred in impoverished areas, the police would often be there, meaning residents and regulars in those areas felt unnecessarily and unfairly targeted as suspects. It's also worth noting that these types of crimes weren't uncommon in these areas. In London in the 1800s, it was rough. London in 2023, rough but less so. At least your children have a good shot of passing their 10th birthday and not being shoved up a chimney at the age of 4. Meaning that these two cases of true crime media don't necessarily reflect what true crime media is like today. The first case of the fraud book is a historical article meant to document happenings. The second case of these pamphlets were meant to warn people in society about goings-on. Maybe some people did find it entertaining, but mostly it had practical use. In 1804, Henry Tufts published a narrative of the life, adventures, travels and sufferings of Henry Tufts, which is likely the first extensive biography of an American criminal. Thomas de Quincey published the essay on Murder Considered as One of the Fine Arts in Blackwood's Magazine in 1827. However, it didn't focus as much on the perpetrator and the homicide itself, rather than how society views crime. I obviously can't go into the full history of true crime because we would literally be here for hours talking about how each continent, nay each country, has covered true crime in the past. But from what I can gather based on what I've read, most of it seemed to be purely informative and looking at society, rather than an individual crime and an individual perpetrator. What's also worthy of note is that in certain countries throughout time there have been what are known as decency laws or obscenity laws, meaning that those who wrote about certain types of crime were unable to go into gratuitous details regarding said crime. So most media that did cover severe crime was mostly clinical and overlooked it as a whole, rather than looking into actually what happened. For example, in Britain, in certain circumstances, it was deemed inappropriate for the public to be informed on certain gross details of a crime. It was deemed inappropriate to subject the public to that kind of content and also aimed to minimize public hysteria. And also, as I've mentioned before, skimping out on the shocking details wouldn't have actually done much because a lot of these homicides took place in impoverished areas, meaning that it was a fact of life for many people. When you cram so many desperate, impoverished people who just want a safe place to stay and something to eat in one area, it's going to be a recipe for disaster. And so for the respectable middle class, the shock value was skimped on because they were protected from it, and for those living in those circumstances, it just wasn't shocking for them at all. This is, of course, until 1888 when the Jack the Ripper spree began. Beforehand, homicide was something that was expected because of struggles, not because of somebody's sick, twisted idea of fun. That was shocking to people because there were actual gruesome details that were amiss. Somebody getting into a bar fight and getting stabbed, that's normal. Somebody taking somebody's kidney away and writing to the police and delivering parts of said kidney to other people, not normal. I would make the argument that the Jack the Ripper case is what sparked true crime as a whole. The mystery and the bizarre actions of the killer are what inspired intrigue that has puzzled people for 200 years. This case is what made police have to defy certain decency, norms and customs, because the killer was very specific, noting that he had some kind of surgical ability, which was important to tell the public about. Perhaps they knew somebody who was a surgeon or a butcher or someone in that field. They had to divulge certain parts of that information to the public, which isn't really something that was seen before. And it is kind of dystopian that people in the upper classes living far away from the crime scene would pick up the morning newspaper to try and find out the latest details of the case, while people living in those poverty-stricken areas were living in total fear that they would be next. An ironic parallel when we're talking about true crime today. So we've covered true crime as a history, how it's gone from factual recounts of historical events to honing in on the shocking and gruesome details. I was interested to see what my audience would say if I asked them what they thought the most common type of crime was. On Twitter, theft was the most common type at 37%, closely followed by SA at 35%, fraud was the third at 22%, and homicide was at 6%. YouTube was vastly different, with SA crimes being 41%, so the most common type, followed by theft at 38%, fraud at 13%, I also managed to add another option of property crime on this one at 5%, and homicide was at 3%. And I would like to say to anyone who voted fraud, you're right on the money. In the United Kingdom, fraud is the most common type of crime. Obviously, this wasn't an official study on whether or not true crime has impacts on people's perceptions of crime, because I can't prove that everyone who voted watches true crime. I also had to smush some types of crime together because Twitter only gave me 4 options and YouTube only gave me 5. Therefore, I had to name very broad categories for each type of crime. For example, I'm assuming that people who would have thought CSA is extremely common would have voted for the SA crimes, when that includes a whole host of crimes. Also, some crimes go hand in hand. You commit fraud in order to steal from somebody, aka commit theft. As well as this, obviously, there are problems when it comes to underreporting. Certain types of crimes will be underreported, such as SA crimes. Therefore, it isn't going to be a completely accurate view. But my argument is we have to go off of statistics. We can't just guess a number when we don't have the numbers in front of us, which is why when some people would say to me, well, it's obviously SA, it's kind of hard to estimate how much it happens, so we're just going to have to go off of official statistics. Also keeping in mind that there will be underreporting problems. But logically, fraud makes sense to me. It is so easy to be a victim of fraud. You can be a victim of fraud literally everywhere, and I know it's the same for all types of crime, including crimes that involve SA. But you can be a victim of fraud completely on your own in your house with no electronic device. Of course, there are things such as scam emails, scam texts, scam calls, but you could also be a victim of fraud by answering your front door and somebody who claims to be representing a charity asks you for money. During quarantine, it's unsurprising that fraud rates skyrocketed because we were all alone in our houses, which means things such as homicide and SA that may occur outside weren't happening because nobody was there. Of course, again, I'm not saying SA only happens outside by a stranger because that is inaccurate. I've talked about this before, how the idea that you'll be attacked by a random stranger is actually less likely than being attacked in your own home. But again, when it comes to fraud, it's such a large category and it can happen in so many different ways, especially with the internet, that it makes sense to me that it is the most common type of crime in the United Kingdom. True crime media, including mainstream news, has impacted people when they think of what crime is and who will be the victim of a crime. When it comes to mainstream media, they are particularly guilty of reporting on cases that involve what is known as a perfect victim. It's a narrative device that paints the victim as pure and innocent in every single way. In Western society, the perfect victim is typically a white young woman, often having a promising career, is loved by friends and family, and has never done anything wrong in their entire lives. And yes, there are victims of crime like this, but what it means is that people who don't represent the ideal of a perfect victim often have their stories neglected. An example of a perfect victim narrative can be found on the SAFE website. In the mainstream narrative of trafficking, the archetype of a perfect victim is someone who was taken against their will and forced into trafficking until the eventual rescue and recovery. A real-life perfect victim case study can be seen in the case of the Rotherham grooming gangs, wherein a network of older men targeted young teenage girls. One of the locations that this grooming would take place was at a local takeaway, where the girls went over and would often receive free food, which would later turn into free alcohol, free cigarettes, free drugs, and even gifts of money, until the men would later turn around and take payment from these teenage girls. This was even used against the girls in court because they weren't just taken off of the street and tied into a basement. They were going over to the takeaway willingly, and they would go to the guys' homes willingly, even though by that point they had already been threatened by the guys that they would harm them and or their families if they'd told anyone. They didn't fit the perfect victim archetype. They weren't prim, proper young ladies who were attending school every day. They were often bunking off of school. They were drinking and smoking and doing drugs. They weren't seen as worthy to be even victims. Some of the court even suggesting that this was consensual, even though some of the girls were as young as 12. The perfect victim narrative truly harms people who don't fit into it. If you're not perfect, you don't have a career, you don't come from a good background, those who are in poverty, perhaps those who are of colour, those who have done crimes themselves don't fit into it, and therefore they're seen as less sympathetic to the public and won't be reported on as much. The perfect victim narrative also goes against statistics as a whole, because the public are being given these stories of perfect young women being taken off of the street and attacked horrifically. While yes, it does happen, it's not accurate. For example, the group of people who are most at risk of being attacked in public are young men. Men are twice as likely to be attacked in public than a woman is. Women are told that they should have their keys in their hand in a claw formation to fend off attackers, when they aren't going to be the most likely group of people to be attacked. And that's with the underreporting, because men are less likely to report crime than a woman is. The statistics still show that they're most at risk. I will say from what I've seen that true crime media in the mainstream tends to be more guilty of this than smaller independent content creators, who tend to take a nuanced view depending on who you're looking at. However, there is a problem when it comes to small-scale content creators, especially when some of them aren't so small anymore with millions of subscribers. So before I get into that, I will make it known that I have made true crime content, but I have certain guidelines that I follow when I make that content, and this is how I make my content as ethical as possible, and I'll go over this for you now. I make several considerations before covering a case. 1. What is the likelihood of the offender being released into the public? I covered the case of Alicia McPhail as there's a likelihood her offender is going to be released within my lifetime. 2. Did the offender receive a reasonable level of justice? Did they get a too light a sentence, or did they die before serving a good amount of it? Did they get away with it for too long? I covered the Babes in the Wood cases, the cases of the Night Stalker, and Suzanne Capper for these reasons. 3. Are there any missing people associated with the case? Fred West is assumed to have ended the life of Mary Bastome, but her body has never been found. 4. Is there a system failing people that led to these crimes? I talked about lockdown cases such as Arthur Labinio because of failing social services. 5. How well known is the case? Does it deserve more coverage? I again covered the case of Susan Capper for not many people knowing about her courage and bravery during her case right until the end. I also have a very particular way of structuring the videos. I try and make sure at the very beginning I put the victims and survivors first if I can, giving you little tidbits about their personality and their interests because I want you to remember them for them and not what happened to them. At the end, I also want to say something to their loved ones. I want them to know that somebody has looked at this case and doesn't just find it entertaining. Of course, when it comes to crimes like this, it can be interesting, but I want them to know that I have heard what they've had to say and spread word of anything they want other people to know about. For example, the mother of Alicia McPhail, Georgina, now works for a charity, and I mentioned that charity in my video and linked it in the description because it's obviously something that she's passionate about. Those are my guidelines when creating content of this nature and why I make them. It's not because I find it a source of entertainment, but something that I believe is pertinent, and I don't think it's the perfect way of covering true crime, if there were to be a perfect way of covering it. While of course there's not a perfect way to cover true crime, there are definitely ways you shouldn't cover true crime. Mukbangs and true crime are something that I detest. I think it is absolutely abhorrent to talk about serious events while eating as if it's just a little kiki that you can have with your friends. I think it's disgusting to put your makeup on and get ready while discussing some of the most serious things that have ever happened to a person in their lives and to their family members and their friends in their lives is so disrespectful. What I will be talking about now is a critique that came up of Eleanor Neale, who is known to be quite a respectable true crime channel. She recently got into some controversy when it was pointed out by a family member of one of the victims of a case that she talked about that she got a lot of details wrong. Creator Mika's Rhetoric covered this in 2 of their own videos, which I will link in the description, and I very much recommend you go and watch them to get the full idea of what happened. I think they did a really good job in explaining the problem. I won't be going over it too much because I don't want to just regurgitate what Mika said, but I will expand on a point that was brought up that I think is relevant. When Eleanor starts the case, she talks about the victim and survivor in a lot of detail, which isn't normally a bad thing. I do it myself. I try and find out about their interests and their hobbies because, again, I don't want them to be remembered for the crime that happened to them. Of course, it's the reason why it's being talked about, but I want you, when you look at a picture of a survivor or victim, to see them as a full person. The problem herein is that Eleanor talks about the survivors or victims as if she knows/knew them, and it doesn't leave much room for error because she talks about it with such great confidence, as if there were no errors made. This is solid research, this is what happened. But with the case that she obviously got some things wrong and the victim's sibling had to correct her on some things, that's evidently not the case. Eleanor and her team didn't do research or made assumptions based on the research they did do. And for me personally, the worst part of this is that these errors were never addressed. The video was removed. I've not seen a tweet from Eleanor or a community post or anything in that regard apologizing to the victim's sibling and family members. It was just gone, poof, never to be seen or heard of again. That video caused harm because you misrepresented the victim and their family, and you just got rid of it and brushed it under the rug. And it isn't just a simple error of saying a date wrong, for example. I have dyscalculia in some of my videos, whether they're true crime related or not. I have said dates incorrectly because I have dyscalculia. I read numbers the wrong way round, or I read out a wrong number in a sequence of numbers. I'll always make sure to put it on screen to correct it or in the pinned comment. It wasn't just a simple incorrect date, or maybe you got one name wrong. You misrepresented a person and their entire family. It's not just as simple as putting a pinned comment up or deleting the video. You can't just do that. You have to make some kind of statement because thousands of people had watched that video. It was already too late by the time you posted it. So it needs to be addressed. I don't care how long ago it was. Eleanor is normally really good when it comes to being respectful, but when the criticism comes and somebody says you got something wrong, the video's just deleted and that's it. The family can't just delete that event in their lives, and they can't just delete the fact that somebody who they'd never met or spoken to before was regurgitating falsehoods about their loved one after their death. They can't just have that not be a thing anymore. It really saddens me that if you watch the rest of Mika's videos, the way she handled it in private wasn't any better. And I would like to apologise on behalf of Eleanor for that to that person. I don't think that means a lot to you, but I really hope that in some way you can get peace from this, because not only did you have to suffer through that tragedy, you had to have somebody else cover it and do it completely wrong. And this is where I'm going to have to talk about the privilege of true crime for those who create it and those who consume it. For those who create true crime, they can gain monetarily from this. It is a catch-22 when it comes to YouTube, however, which is probably the most prominent video sharing platform. YouTube and its algorithm favors videos that are monetized. So if your videos aren't monetized, then they aren't going to get seen. You aren't going to get the exposure that you want. If you're like me, I want my videos to be seen. Not only because, well, I work hard on them and I'd like them to be seen, but also if I'm talking about a case that I think deserves exposure, then I want the video to get exposure. You have to have your video monetized in order for people to see it or to increase the chances of it being seen. But even so, it can be a job for people who are like Eleanor Neale and have millions of subscribers. They profit directly off of covering tragedies that happen to other people. And yes, that definitely is a privilege, being paid for talking about other people's tragedies and earning money from it, being able to pay for your rent and food making this content. Sitting safely at home talking about terrible things that happen to other people, while other people still go through these things, and there are other family members and friends out there who have to deal with the consequences of those things. I talked about this parallel before when discussing Jack the Ripper and his case, the upper classes reading the newspaper every morning while tucked up in their lovely safe home away from all of the poor people down in the slums who were actually at risk of being murdered. And we're going to go full circle with this, bringing back my poll, because when you think of the most common types of crime being the violent ones, who are the people that you are envisioning committing those crimes? Oh, it's the working class, isn't it? Yes, it is a fact that being impoverished and or being of a lower class is a risk factor when it comes to committing and or being a perpetrator of certain crimes. True crime itself serves to cover up the crimes of the upper class. Yes, guys, Marx is here and he's talking through me, But isn't it true? How many times have you heard of a fraud case being brought up and then brushed away to the side? Embezzlement, just a thing that happened that no one focuses on because it doesn't have gory details? The current state of true crime focuses on the violent crime that averts our attention away from the upper class. Coverage of true crime serves to continue the stigmatization of the working class and ignore the crimes of the upper classes. Financial crimes, property crimes, fraud isn't as exciting because we have hyped up violent crimes to the max. Even though statistically they aren't as common, these crimes associated with the working class are not as common as those crimes associated with the upper class. We are still more invested in them because we have been conditioned to focus on them. Yes, there are certain evolutionary and psychological aspects to the violent crimes that bring our attention more, but we are feeding into it by only looking at those things. We are substituting critical thought for intrigue, and while creators sit in their homes nice and safely talking about horrific things, we are protecting those above who are also committing atrocities because we aren't looking at them. We aren't looking at the CEOs that are sucking their employees dry of their money through employer exploitation. We aren't looking at embezzlement and fraud that screws over so many people because of one case that happened that isn't frequent at all, but we now believe is a true and real everyday risk. Which means people aren't looking critically at their own lives, how they're being treated by employers, how they're being financially screwed over, because in our minds it's not the worst thing that could possibly happen to us. We could be locked in a basement and yeeted, but realistically, that isn't the true danger for us as a working class people. Which leads to consumers. People also sat safe, alone, at home, listening to true crime podcasts. You're safe, you're happy, but somebody else has gone through something that you're listening to about while you're safe and happy. There are grieving family members and friends out there while you're sit down, tucked up, tweeting out #TrueCrimeDateNight. And companies and corporations know this, which is why Netflix released their Dharma docuseries. They know that people are intrigued in this and that they find entertainment out of this, and that's why they create them, even though family members and friends of the victims are begging them to stop. As someone who also watches true crime, I have to be highly critical of myself. Me watching true crime isn't productive, and I'm even questioning in some circumstances if it's ethical of me. I'm fairly content with my own coverage. I'm still a human being who's working through things and trying to figure out what is and isn't exploitative, trying to find out respectful ways of covering things that I find are important. I know my intention is there, but my execution is one of the most important things. It's something that I'll probably be learning about for the rest of my life. It's such a complex issue with true crime today. Is consuming true crime media harmful? Is creating true crime media harmful? Is there an ethical way to do either of these things? I think that's a question that we will never be able to answer, ever. It's such a tough topic because as somebody who consumes true crime and somebody who makes true crime, even with the guidelines that I set for myself, it's hard to know when I'm being hypocritical. I haven't covered a fraud case. I haven't covered anything of that nature, something that fits into my guidelines I should be creating. So what can I do as a person to bring about a better place for true crime in my own little way? Making this video was my solution. I want people to know that true crime as a history has only recently become more shocking. I want people to understand that true crime content doesn't necessarily reflect the reality of crime day to day. I want people to know and understand that there are people behind these cases, some people still living, who struggle with the consequences every single day, and I hope people would be more mindful of that. As for any other questions, I don't know if we'll ever answer it. Is there a perfect way to cover true crime or consume it? Who knows? All I know is that as a person myself, I can learn and grow by listening to the experiences of other people and see if there's any way that I can do anything to help. For example, I did not watch the Jeffrey Dahmer docu-series as soon as I heard that the family members were not happy with it. That was my small little way of doing something for them. Did it impact it at all? Probably not, but personally, I'm happy with that decision. So, what do you guys think? I'm fairly confident in my ability to understand the history of true crime media and its implications for how we view true crime. Do you guys think that true crime media itself has skewed public perception as to what crime is like day to day? Do you think that there are people who are really bad at covering true crime that I haven't mentioned, or people who are really good at covering it? Should it be covered at all? Do you think that we can reach some kind of middle ground when it comes to true crime media? Because I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon. And if there's a solution, I'd love to hear about it. So with that, I bid you adieu. This has been a very rambled mess of trying to piece things together to find some kind of middle ground that I don't know if we're ever going to be able to find. And with that, good night, guys.